How many neurons, or how many connections, does it take to recreate one image in our mind? Consider that people who suffer from early onset or congenital blindness have activity in the areas which we would normally associate with seeing. When early blind subjects have their visual cortex stimulated, they feel tactile sensation rather than seeing flashes or phosphenes, glowing patches, as sighted or late blind subjects would experience. Similar TMS levels evoke visual experience of phosphenes when applied over occipital cortex in some congenitally blind people, those who are blind but retain some light or motion sensitivity, and sighted subjects. VTAL, 2002. However, TMS to occipital cortex elicits no phosphenes in most early blind subjects who have no previous visual functions. Visual cortex activity in early and late blind people. This phenomenon, where regions of the brain thought to be associated with one sensory modality come to be used by others, known as cross-modal plasticity, tells us that neurons or nervous systems, in and of themselves, are not necessarily enough to produce a particular phenomenal quality of experience. I mention this by way of an introduction to addressing the second part of the question, which asks how the signals in the neurons can create thoughts and images, etc. It is all too easy, and overwhelmingly popular, to think of our conscious experience as comparable to the experience that we have of using computers. We see the image on the screen and understand that it is composed of illuminated pixels, and can imagine something like an array of neural pixels or codes for vector screen drawing. To understand why this is false, I would recommend this paper, The Neural Binding Problems, which describes 4 different aspects of the relation between the ontology of perception and neuroscientific data, one of which is considered still to be an intractable problem. The author writes, "There is now overwhelming biological and behavioral evidence that the brain contains no stable, high-resolution, full-field representation of a visual scene, even though that is what we subjectively experience." Martinez-Conde et al. 2008. The structure of the primate visual system has been mapped in detail, Cost and Collins 2003, and there is no area that could encode this detailed information. The subjective experience is thus inconsistent with the neural circuitry. In other words, while the idea that there is a screen inside of our brains showing movies is obviously false, even the more sophisticated idea that there is an area of our brains which corresponds to screen data without a literal screen is false as well. This should be a fairly shocking revelation. However, think about the implications of how it would have to work for other senses. To remember the aroma of warm chocolate chip cookies, for example, would require that there be some coded signal within the olfactory bulb and elsewhere in the brain that is isomorphic to the molecules of cookie or molecule detecting events. While we intuitively reach for a digital or analog copy of optical patterns being represented neurologically, it is less intuitive to think of how such a 3-dimensional structure of cookie particles or 4-dimensional metabolic function could be analogized or represented as a smell or flavor experience. Instead of a data set of signals which can be decoded as pixels or lines that seem visually self-evident, we would have to have a kind of neural kitchen, reproducing copies of the originally smelled substances. Think about how geometry is represented by binary digital code in a computer. We see a graphic line drawn on the computer screen, but we know that there is no line drawn inside the CPU, only various microelectronic switches which are figuratively aligned or not even aligned but just used by a programmer to generate a sequence of repeating functions which becomes aligned bits when it is processed by the video card. Bits aren't real. There are no ones and zeros literally inside a computer, and nothing that is being represented graphically. This is a huge problem for the GUI metaphor for consciousness, because the video interface of our computers are only useful for human users, not to the computer itself. The CPU does not need to draw a triangle anywhere in order to work with mathematical figures that we consider triangular. It's purely digital relations. If such a system were used by the brain, it would be redundant for there to be data which is received, then encoded as an unexplained phenomenal format, then decoded as a phenomenal experience, in order to get the same data that was there in the first place. It would be like writing a program which would simulate a camera inside of the CPU, and then an audience for that camera. There is no plausible explanation for why a computer would or could make use of a non-computational phenomenon like images or sound just to encode a perfectly compressible set of quantitative neural data. To ask how many neurons it takes to remember an image may be a question that assumes too much. It is like asking how many cars have to be in the parking lot of a stadium for there to be a football game. As lengthy as this answer is, I have only scratched the surface of the issues that we run into when we try to write consciousness off as a physical process in the brain. There's plankton with eyes that are made of 2 cells which have no brain at all. Do they see something? And is it an image? There's researchers like Bruce Grayson who study NDEs and OBs, reincarnation, and other exotic cases where there appears to be conscious experience which transcends the body altogether. We don't have to lose our skeptical stance, however, to understand that the ontology of perception is not as simple as it seems. By default, we take our conscious experience for granted, so that it takes a lot of practice to really begin to imagine how physics could work without consciousness, and even more imagination to think about how or why such an unconscious physics would ever develop perception.